Welcome back, everybody, to the Movie Palace podcast. As ever, I am your host, Carl Sweeney, and thank you very much for joining me for another brand new episode of the show. And on this one, we're tackling one of the most renowned films of all time, I think it's fair to say, because we're looking at none other than Citizen Kane from 1941, of course, directed by and starring Orson Welles. And it's a pleasure to be joined on the podcast once again to discuss this landmark movie by Raquel Stetcher. Hello, Raquel.
Hi, Carl. Thanks for inviting me to talk about this very intimidating subject.
It does come with like a towering reputation, doesn't it? It does. It
Yes,
is.
it
I,
does.
I can see why you would use the word intimidating. Yeah, but we're gonna take it on. Before we do get into Citizen Kane, though, I will say to listeners, please stay tuned to the very end of the podcast for an announcement that you might well find interesting and significant. So I'll come back to that at the end, Raquel. But before we go much further, let me introduce Citizen Kane. So, like I said, 1941 film by Orson Welles. In the movie, we begin with the death of Welles's character, Charles Foster Kane, and he says on his deathbed, he says the word Rosebud. And we discover that Kane was a notorious, press tycoon. We see a newsreel talking about all the big events of his life and his relationships and so on. And then there's an investigator, a reporter, Mr. Thompson, who is sent to find out what does Rosebud mean. And he goes to interview people involved with Kane who knew him. And we get flashbacks and we learn more about the man. It's a quest then to see if we can discover who this man was, what did Rosebud mean, and so on. And I'll give a spoiler warning at this point. If you haven't seen Citizen Kane, if you don't know what Rosebud is, now is a good time to pause the podcast, go and watch the movie for the first time, and then come back to us. Raquel, where should we start with this? Personal history with the movie. Like you sort of said there, it comes with this kind of big reputation, can make it a bit intimidating to talk about. Can you remember becoming aware of this movie, seeing it for the first time?
Well, I knew of Citizen Kane for a long time before I had actually watched it. And Orson Welles, especially in the 80s, even after his death in 85, was still very much a pop culture figure. Clips of him and his circuit on the talk shows were still very popular, and he was just still a popular name. So I knew of Orson Welles, but Citizen Kane I had heard of, but I had not seen until I went to undergraduate school. I went to Northeastern University, and as an elective, I took a Film 101 course. And of course, like pretty much any Film 101, Intro to Film History course is going to have Citizen Kane. It's one of those films that is very conducive to studying because it is considered one of the best of all time, and there's so much history with it. So that was the first time I had seen it. And I'm glad I waited until that film course because we had read Robert Carringer's book on the making of the film. We really studied it and by different angles. I did a presentation on one of the scenes, and it was a very enriching experience watching the movie along with the history and the context and analyzing it as a filmmaking subject. And I think that really enriched the experience. And I also recommend to people, when you do watch Citizen Kane, have some knowledge beforehand of why it's considered one of the best films of all time, because that does help with the experience.
Can you remember which scene you analysed for your presentation?
Oh, absolutely. It's the scene where Charles Foster Kane's parents are arranging his adoption, and we were basically breaking down different scenes and how they were basically composed. And I was in charge of that scene just to show how thematically how the different people were positioned in the scene. And I'm sure we'll get into this more later, but how there's like, Greg Toland's cinematography work, how the different characters are positioned, and the meaning of the scene and how it kind of influences the rest of the movie, how it kind of sets the tone for the rest of the movie.
It's a good scene. I hope the presentation went down well. I'm sure it did. I think I saw this film at the age of 16, and I remember being very aware of its reputation already, before I saw it, because you would
Hmm.
just hear people talk about other films and they would say things like, well, it's no Citizen Kane, but, it would always be like used as a bit of a shorthand for a great movie. I wonder if those kinds of comments actually can have a bit of a negative effect because you hear that something is so great and then quite often when it's like that, whatever it is doesn't quite live up to the hype. But with Citizen Kane, I think it really does. Or the other assumption I think people might make sometimes is you hear that something is like, it's such a masterpiece and maybe there's an assumption that that makes it something of a chore to sit through or something. But
Right.
again, not with Citizen Kane, I don't think, because Citizen Kane is really entertaining and it really is remarkable and it can be enjoyed in all sorts of different ways and it's not just entertaining but it's substantial as well, but I don't think it kind of beats you over the head with how substantial and great it is. And like you're saying, it's one of the most studied films ever made and
Hmm.
most acclaimed. So I think it's both a great film and a great movie, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it sets the bar really high, but it meets the bar at that really high level.
Yeah.
And I also think that, because there is so much pressure in it being considered one of the best of all time, it was on Sight and Sound's list as number one for a long time, AFI lists. I mean, a lot of people have considered this the best of all time, and that's a very sort of intimidating, very loaded position to have. So I'm sure people who hadn't seen it go to see it and like, I'm going to be the one person who doesn't like this movie. So it also faces that challenge too,
Yeah.
where that sort of recognition creates a barrier to entry. But I think that's where the context in the film history really help because okay, this is the best movie of all time, tell me why. And that's why it's such a great film to have in a film course because that's an opportunity to really show you why this is one of the great films.
Yeah, because I think it can stand up to the most like rigorous like analysis
Mhm.
because it's so brilliantly constructed, so technically superb, and there's a lot going on below the surface. And like you say, if you have that interest in film history, there are so many factors to enjoy as well. So I think what we're going to do is talk about some of the big areas of interest with this movie. We're aware that you can't cover everything that there is to say about Citizen Kane in one podcast.
We'd be here for hours.
Yeah, no, it would be a whole mini series, I think, at least. Yeah. But shall we start with Orson Welles, Raquel? What's your sense of,
Yes.
where he was coming into the making of this film? Because I think that's probably one of the things that people will be most interested in, isn't it? That here's a young man, like prodigiously turning out a masterpiece film. What's your sense of where he was before this movie?
What I think is incredible is that he was 25 years old when he made this movie, and this is his first movie, and he doesn't even know how to make movies at this point. But that was always his approach. I mean, when he was a child, he was like a poet, he was trying all of these different things. Then he started the Mercury Theater, and he didn't have theater experience, but he just went for it. And then he started his own radio program. And even before making Citizen Kane, the War of the Worlds broadcast, which was incredibly controversial because a lot of people tuned in thinking that this was an actual news report of, something really bad happening on planet Earth, but it really wasn't. So even he had already started a theater group, started a radio show, made a name for himself, and by the time he came to make this movie, he was 25 years old and went to make the one of the greatest movies of all time. And I was listening to an interview recently with Orson Welles, and he said something really interesting that really struck me was that he had all the confidence of ignorance. He approached this movie the way he approached making the theater group and the radio show is he didn't know what he was doing, but he had a vision. He surrounded himself with talented people, and he just went for it. And he wasn't scared to really just be bold and innovative. I think one of the things that is approached in film courses and was approached in the course that I took on Film 101 was that, hey, we're early 20 somethings, in our late teens in some cases. And here's another person who's a peer, essentially around our age, doing something astounding. So I always thought that was really interesting. And as I said before, Orson Welles was very much part of the culture. He was sort of this chameleon over the decades after Citizen Kane. He was making his movies, but then he was also a raconteur, delivering all these wonderful interviews and stories, and he was making all these very strange commercials. He was part of the public conversation up until his death. And when I was in my teens, I watched John Lovett's show The Critic, where he plays sort of a Roger Ebert type of film critic. And I think that was my first exposure to Orson Welles because he's spoofed in the show. And I'm like, oh, who is this kind of quirky, eccentric character? So even before I'd even heard of Citizen Kane, I had learned of Welles that way. So Wells is just like an endlessly fascinating guy because of how he started and then how he kind of continues, and we still talk about him today.
Yeah, in kind of a similar, it's not exactly the same as your example with The Critic, but I do remember seeing Citizen Kane, like I say, at the age of 16, and realizing that I had seen a lot of nods to Citizen Kane from The Simpsons, because it seemed like
Yes,
they had parodied just about every scene in the movie at various points, you know.
that is true.
Yeah, like I'm sure there's a Mr. Burns song, which is like similar to the Charlie Kane song in the movie, for example. Yeah, with Wells then. So to go back a little bit. So in the middle of 1939, the contract is signed then between him and RKO
Hmm.
and the Mercury Theatre. So at the beginning of the movie, you get the card that says a Mercury production by Orson Welles. And then at the end, it's when the actors are introduced, isn't it? It says most of the principal actors in Citizen Kane are new to motion pictures. The Mercury Theatre is proud to introduce them. As I understand it, he had a couple of false starts. He was interested in adapting Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad.
Yes.
And part of the deal, I think a lot is made about the freedom he had as part of that contract, and that's true, but part of it was that the budget was capped. So with Heart of Darkness, I think he wanted to use a lot of subjective camera, like the movie Lady in the Lake did later on. I think his idea was that there'd be a prologue where he's talking about and explaining point of view camera work, and the audience would see shots from like the POV of a bird in a cage, or a man on death row, or a golfer hitting a ball, all these kinds of things, and then would see a shot from Orson Welles' perspective looking into the camera. But that project, like I say, didn't come to pass. There was another stillborn project called The Smiler with a Knife, and then I think he was on to Citizen Kane. So yeah, I think Citizen Kane is talked about in terms of freedom a lot, isn't it? I think people are quite enchanted with the idea that Wells had a lot of freedom. Like I say, he had a budget he had to work within.
Hmm.
The studio had to approve the subject, but beyond that, I think the idea of him having the freedom to do what he wanted is quite appealing to a lot of people, isn't it? I think.
Someone I heard called him an independent filmmaker working within the studio system. And I think that's quite accurate. Like he had his own special brand of genius, and people recognized that. So he had some sort of level of freedom, but he also had to be within the constraints of the studio system. So, like you said, they were on a pretty tight budget. So he had a budget to work with, and he had a timeline to work with, and then he had to leave the editing and go to South America to film something. So he had a lot of freedom, and the fact that he was able to bring all those Mercury Theater players along with him, that's kind of unheard of. Like he basically just brought his whole troupe over to make this movie, and you see at the end of the film sort of an introduction to all of the players that are in the movie. And a lot of these actors hadn't been in a movie at all. This was like their first time in a movie. So it is quite a unique point. And this is what I think is actually so wonderful about Citizen Kane is that it's unlike anything that came from the period, and it's kind of a miracle that it was made because of the freedom that he had, that Orson Welles had, but also because he was so bold in his vision and he was taking on one of the most powerful people of the era. I mean, like it's quite amazing that this movie even was made and released.
It is, and we're going to come on to some of those things about the origins of the story, and also,
Hmm.
like you say, Wells's vision, the way he told the story in terms of like narrative techniques, but also technical aspects. Just quickly though, what do you think he brings to this as an actor? Because that's maybe another thing about the confidence of youth, isn't it? He's like he's not just making this great movie; he decides to take the lead role on himself, and does a very good job, I think. Would you agree?
I think so. I'd heard another interview where somebody was saying that he very much flirts with the camera, and you can tell that he's got this chemistry with the camera, and he's already got this background in the theater, so he in radio, so he knows how to project and perform. And here's the camera sort of following around in all of these states of being because he goes from very young Kane to like very old Kane. And you can tell that the camera loves him and then he loves the camera. And one thing I noticed on this recent viewing is that when he plays older Kane, his walk changes.
Yeah.
He's much stiffer. And that's something that's just like one small element that he didn't necessarily have to include in the subtlety in how he does it. Because you could always have somebody kind of hunched over, maybe walking with a cane, and but he does it more in a subtle manner.
Mm.
And also one thing too that maybe not a lot of people know about Orson Welles is he almost never wore the his actual nose in a movie. He had nose prosthetics in so many of his films, and he just kind of flourished with makeup and kind of altering his figure, which he does in this movie to great effect.
Yeah. I think he's very good in this movie. I think he's very good as the young Kane, because he brings a high level of, like you're saying, flirting with the camera, but it's like a high level
Mhm.
of charm and energy that
Yes.
can be quite, in a way, kind of overpowering. Like when he comes in and he's going to shake up the newspaper and there's the older guy there who, like, is kind of blustering a little bit. I think he's Wells is very good in that sequence. I think he's good as the younger Kane, like in scenes where you see him and Susan and he's wiggling his ears. And like I say, he's got that level of charm. He's convincing as the older Kane too, and that's a good point about his walk. I think I read that he'd worn some kind of back brace to help him get that
Uh,
stiff effect. But yeah, as Kane's isolation increases, he's quite good there too.
and his sort of like hamming it up in those
Yeah.
early scenes at the newspaper when he's like poaching all of the staff from the Chronicle and he's having that party with the dancers. He's really hamming it up. And it could come off as bombastic, but this is Orson Welles and like there's some level of genius within him that just gives more substance than had somebody else without that kind of innate substance delivered the same performance.
Yeah, and I think actually, people who are very self-absorbed are often very superficially charming. So the
Hmm.
fact that Kane is like that as a young man is quite appropriate, I think. Just very quickly, because we're going to focus obviously on Citizen Kane, but do you
Hmm.
think Wells ever lived up to this movie afterwards? Because obviously a long career, directed many other films. Like you say, did lots of different things, lots of acting. But do you like anything else that he did as much as you do Citizen Kane? Would you say?
I do like some of his work. Touch of Evil I had seen for the first time recently and really came to appreciate that film. I think that is sort of at the level of composition and lighting and technique that Citizen Kane was. Like it's not up there completely, but it's really close. And I would say The Lady from Shanghai is okay. It's not great, but it does some really interesting techniques, especially with the mirrors at the end. I mean, like The Stranger is interesting. There's a few films of his that are interesting. I There are some of his later films, and the one that was just released recently I haven't seen yet, so I'm not as familiar. But The Magnificent Ambersons, I know that's also considered maybe his second best film. I didn't really care for it, and I did what they did. attempt to make the Magnificent Ambersons much later on in Orson Welles' vision. I know Jonathan Rhys-Meyers was in that movie and some other folks. That was awful. Now, obviously, Orson Welles did not make that, but he did have. I mean, if we want to talk about movies paired with other movies, Citizen Kane and the Magnificent Ambersons kind of meld together because those were two very unique visions. They came kind of back to back, and in both cases, Orson Welles had wanted to do something with it and was held back in some respect, less so in Citizen Kane and more so in The Magnificent Ambersons. But I would have to say, out of all of his later films that I have seen, I think The Touch of Evil is probably my favorite.
It's one of those things when you start with Citizen Kane, like how exactly do you top that? And I think that
Yes.
nothing later is quite as brilliant and near perfect as Citizen Kane is. But like you, I'm very fond of Touch of Evil, because it is technically brilliant, like you say. For example, the opening sequence with the bomb going over the border, and some of the direction is incredible. I quite like The Lady from Shanghai, as odd and bonkers as it is at points. But I think Citizen Kane is the one. In terms of his acting, I would say his appearance in The Third Man really is terrific.
Oh, yes. Yes, that's another example of him having this very great chemistry with the camera. And the lighting techniques in that film
Yeah.
are amazing.
Yeah, it's a wonderful introduction to his character who's been talked about for a long time and then finally appears. And then he has this very memorable monologue.
With the shot of the cat at his feet and it goes up to his face. Oh, perfect.
Okay, so to bring things back to Citizen Kane, we wanted to talk about the story and how the film tells that story. So, yeah, the origins of the film. I suppose that's one of the things that has made this a very... I think you get a lot of gossip around Citizen Kane, don't you? And
right.
There are certain myths that have sprung up around it. And maybe that kind of enhances the interest in it in a certain way. Because people talk about William Randolph Hearst and there's dispute about exactly the extent to which the film is based on him and so on and so forth. What's your sense of that, Raquel?
I have to say, in this recent viewing of it, I really came to appreciate the fact that he took on pretty much the most powerful man in media with Citizen Kane, which is quite a goal. And I think that's also speaks to why Citizen Kane still kind of speaks to audiences today, because it really explores the media and, how much can you trust the media? And it does that from the very beginning with that sort of propaganda piece of I forget what it's called, the news of the
on the
time.
March. Yeah.
News on the March. And it's this very sort of like interesting little documentary about Kane's life, and you already know, okay, there's something that's up. Like this seems almost like a little fairy tale story. And it's interesting that he took on this huge figure in the media, knowing very well that the media can make or break a movie, and he was the most powerful, and he could easily have just broken this movie. And there were attempts to stifle it, but it kind of speaks to the fact that this is such a strong story, strong screenplay, strong film, that it just kind of lived on beyond that.
It does sound like those perceptions definitely had an effect, because there was kind of a vendetta against it in the Hearst press. Mm-hmm. There was also efforts within Hollywood to get RKO to burn the negative. Yeah, the idea of Hearst's newspapers being forbidden to mention RKO Productions after this Citizen Kane scandal and the threat of a kind of blacklisting. It does seem like it must have done serious damage to the film financially, because it's not one of those films that was a big commercial hit. It wasn't at all. In terms of Hearst himself, it does seem like it obviously uses him as a kind of a springboard, as much as Welles denied it. And I've got a couple of quotes from him where he does deny it. But there are deviations too. I think there are crucial differences between the Susan Alexander character and Marion Davis in real life. And part of the fun, in a way, well, I suppose probably audiences today don't think about it too much, because William Randolph Hearst is quite removed from us historically now. But I suppose audiences at the time might have been thinking that way a bit more, mightn't they? Like, which aspects here are more fictional than others? You know what I mean? So, for example, Marion Davis being compared to Susan Alexander might be seen as a bit unfair because Susan Alexander we see is completely untalented, which is not
Yes.
true to say of Marion Davis, for example.
Although it wouldn't work for the story had she been talented. So I feel like even though I do see the connections between Marion Davis and Susan Kane, but if they had made her a successful opera singer, it wouldn't make sense for the story because it really was showing how Kane's ego was destroying his marriages.
Yeah.
But I mean I do see this as more biographical than I think both with Hearst, but also with Wells himself. I feel like there's a lot of biographical ties that it's kind of hard to separate the two.
Yes, because there are things like Kane has this vendetta against a public transit company, and
Hmm.
it's kind of modelled on Hearst having a vendetta against the Southern Pacific Railway. Xanadu, the Great Hall at Xanadu, is kind of modelled on a photograph of the Great Hall at Hearst's place, San Simeon. But then you get other areas where it's less clear cut, like Kane's origins being slightly different, and yeah, there's an interesting interplay. What Wells said was because he vigorously denied that he had used Hearst as a model. He said that he'd wanted to make a film about a very important man, but he decided against making a film. Decided against making a film about an American president. So then he said, "I could find no other position in public life beside that of a newspaper publisher, in which a man of enormous wealth exercises what might be called real power in a democracy. There was no other solution except to make Kane a newspaper publisher, the owner of a great chain of newspapers." So the way he tells it in that statement, it's like, well, just, logically it ended up this way. It wasn't meant to be Hearst or whatever. But you can understand why he would say that at the time, given the pressure that was coming his way, I suppose.
And he could still weave in the presidential storyline because we see Kane having these political ambitions, running for governor. And at one point he says, "Oh, you're looking at, future president here," but without actually having him be a president. And one of the things too is people love stories about people in power, how they achieve that power, how they abuse that power. I was just thinking of Robert Caro's book, The Power Broker, and how influential that was in nonfiction literature. And this one is very much about a, albeit fictional, powerful person. But those stories are really interesting because they sort of tie into that American dream of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps and making something of yourself. And it also is a scathing look at privilege too, because he, although comes from very little, was given this very privileged opportunity to be raised by this business tycoon and have all this money to spend on his dream of running a newspaper. So I don't know. There's a lot here that I think would is of interest to people and a lot you can do when you're focusing on somebody with a lot of power.
And I think because that idea of like powerful men never goes away, I think even this many years later,
Yes.
when we probably don't care as much about William Randolph Hearst, generally speaking, but I think people coming to Citizen Kane later on do see the parallels with, let's say, Rupert Murdoch or Donald Trump, for example, at various points. Trump very much admires Citizen Kane, by the way. There's an interesting clip online of him giving his analysis of Citizen Kane, which boils down at the end to the guy needed a different wife. It's kind of what Trump says. But anyway.
And then you also find modern examples of billionaires influencing the media, like Jeff Bezos from Amazon buying the Washington Post, and then also Peter Thiel, the billionaire who took down Gawker.
Yeah.
So that's still like a modern story of somebody with wealth and power having this oftentimes dangerous effect on the media, which is quite problematic.
Yeah. And I think some of the specifics change, but those big
Hmm.
themes recur through history, I think, for sure. Um, okay, then. So with Citizen Kane, so it has these interesting real origins that people at the time, for sure, would have been thinking about in a lot of
Right.
cases. And then the way it tells that story is so fascinating as well, isn't it? And it's quite intriguing to try and put ourselves in the mindset of somebody sitting down to see this movie in 1941 and
Hmm.
wonder what they would have perceived as like unusual or different. So, what do you think, Raquel? In what ways do you think the way that Wells and company tell this story are, unusual or worth noting?
Well, it is one big flashback, and I think it's interesting that it starts with Kane's death because if you're talking about somebody with a lot of wealth and a lot of power, it doesn't matter how much of either you gain, everyone has the same fate and everyone is going to die. And that's a theme throughout the story. There's a great line that Joseph Cotton delivers about old age is the disease that you don't look forward to being cured of. So I think that that sets the tone, the fact that it starts with the death and kind of flashes back. And then the whole story, like you get the death and then you get the newsreel, which is sort of like a visual obituary. And then it just keeps going back and forth and back and forth. You have the child, it kind of goes in chronological order, but because the whole story is told through this sort of investigation of what is Rosebud, you go to, right after Kane's death and interviewing the people in his life and to flashbacks to Kane's life sort of in chronological order. So there's flashback techniques all over the place. And while that could be confusing in maybe another movie, it just all seems to work because of how it's framed as sort of this investigation and that we're following along. Not that flashbacks weren't used before this, but I also think that this particular film, as was The Maltese Falcon, which released the same year, were sort of the springboard for film noir because of the lighting techniques and flashbacks and storytelling techniques and visual styles. Citizen Kane is not a film noir, but there's things that you can see that film noir gathered from it. So I don't know. I think the overall the narrative structure seems choppy, but it really something about how it's structured seems very cohesive, even though it's jumping back and forth through time.
It's very nifty structurally because, like you say,
Yeah.
there's the potential for it to be confusing, and I think it finds ways to sidestep that. So, like for example, when Thompson goes to see Susan Alexander to begin with, and she doesn't want to speak, well, that actually has quite a useful function because if she'd been the first one to go into the flashback, then we would have met Kane later on, wouldn't we? Because she came along later, but he comes back to her towards the end of the movie after we've already seen Kane as a younger man, and that works well. And everything just seems to enhance the level of interest. Like you say, it's not just that it uses flashbacks because earlier films have done that, but I do think Citizen Kane helped to popularize stories that used flashbacks. Like you say, it could be choppy, and sometimes it reorders events, doesn't it? Like we see that opera premiere twice, don't we, from different
Right.
perspectives, but it doesn't ever get confusing. I think another thing worth highlighting is like the ending is quite open, isn't it, for a film of
Mhm.
that era? Because Thompson has this kind of quest that he's undertaking. He's trying to find out what Rosebud is, and of course he fails in that quest, even though the viewer soon after discovers what Rosebud is, but the investigator doesn't. So that's quite interesting, isn't it? That a film from 1941 would do that. I think.
I think that's a wonderful piece of filmmaking because that's a bit of information that only the audience has. None of the characters in this world have it. The only one who did have it before was Charles Foster Kane himself, and he has passed. And I think it's interesting too with the storyline of the house staff member who's like, "Hey, how much are you going to pay me for the answer?" But then he's there oblivious to the fact that Rosebud itself is being put into this furnace and being burned. And so it has like it's twofold. It solves the mystery, but it also kind of gives just the audience this sort of power over the characters in the movie. Like they were never able to figure out, but we know.
But how much do we learn from that revelation, I suppose? Because I think people have looked at the Rosebud thing in different ways, haven't they? And, there's a tendency to think about it as a puzzle with a specific meaning that tells us something about the character. Or then there's like the other position, which Thompson in the film kind of says, where he's like, well, it wouldn't have explained anything anyway. No single word can explain a man's life. So I guess the other way of looking at it is like, you can't reduce somebody to such a simple explanation. I think the interesting thing is that you can take both of those sides, both of those perspectives can come out of this film quite validly, I think, because you can attach a meaning to Rosebud, and at the same time, maybe it is a bit too simplistic to boil things down in that way. I don't know. How much do you think Rosebud tells us about Charles Foster Kane, I suppose?
I think it ties back to that wonderful scene with the boarding house, and I think it's what Mr. Thatcher that's
Yeah.
adopting him in order to get the rights to the gold. And you see, this is the last moment of bliss, of real kind of innocent bliss that Charles Foster Kane has in his life, because he's outside in this very idyllic setting, not necessarily in the poor boarding house, but outside in the snow, playing with his favorite toy, Rosebud the sled. And inside the house, these negotiations for the next phase in his life are being made without any of his input. So this is a childhood interrupted. He goes from one life and drastically into another and has to leave all of that behind. And playing with the rosebud was the last moment of that childhood. And it also kind of shows what in the end was really precious to Kane was that those moments of happiness. And he kept trying to seek that with his marriages, with his choosing what business he wanted to go into, acquiring all of those statues and traveling and having this huge mansion, but none of that fulfilled him emotionally like that one moment in the snow, in a moment of innocence, just enjoying life. So I think it has a lot to say about him as a character. And I think it's easy to look at a character who has all this wealth and privilege and power and kind of hold them at arm's length, as like, I'm never going to know what that's like. But we're all going to remember one moment of joy from our childhood where we just felt very free and happy. So that's one way also that we can connect, in my vision, to Kane. And that's why I think that one scene is probably the most powerful scene in the whole movie, just because it launches the story, but it says so much about Kane that is really kind of hidden from this. It's like deeper down in his soul.
Yeah, well, Orson Welles talked about it at one point, and he said in his subconscious it represented the simplicity, the comfort, above all the lack of responsibility in his home, and also it stood for his mother's love, which Kane never lost. I think that the other thing that's really interesting about the investigative structure is like how the investigator isn't really characterized much. It's much
Hmm.
more about the search than it is about the person, because Thompson is often positioned in darkness, often he's positioned with his back to the audience, and I quite liked your comparison there with the Maltese Falcon in a way, but that's very different to something like the Maltese Falcon, isn't it? Where
Right.
the charisma of the detective is really central, whereas here it's so notable, isn't it, that the main character, the main investigative character, is treated in a really unusual way. It's quite striking, I think.
That's a really good point, because like you said, he's pretty much, we don't really know hardly anything about him other than all of these journalists are very interested in finding out what Rosebud is. And yeah, you're right. He's obscured in darkness. There's a point where he's talking to Bernstein, I think, and you just see the back of him. And when they do that intro to the Mercury players at the very end, it's that shot, I think, that they show of that actor, and you can't really see his face. And that is quite different. Also, maybe that is a way to take the focus off the investigator, because that could be a very central figure, and make sure a lot of it's on Kane. And
Yeah,
then the notable figures in Kane's life who are basically carrying on his legacy through the stories that they can tell about him.
yeah. So I think it's so interesting the way that's done, and I think in general, what's worth noting is that there's quite a high level of ambiguity, and the character of Kane remains enigmatic even to the very end of the film, even after the
Mm-hmm.
Rosebud revelation, I think. So that's worth highlighting for a film from 1941, I would say. Um,
Mm-hmm.
just while we're talking about the way the story is told, there's been a long-running discussion about Wells's collaboration with Herman Mankiewicz, and
Mm-hmm.
discussions about the authorship of Citizen Kane. I don't know. Have you picked up on sort of the big debates there and what people think about the collaboration between the two men, Mankiewicz and Wells? Like, what's your sense of how they work together? I suppose.
I was trying to look for a photo of Orson Welles and Herman Mankiewicz winning the Oscar for the best original screenplay, which is the only Oscar out of the nine that the movie was nominated for that won. And I couldn't find anything, but also that's sort of a lesser award. But both of them received their own Oscars with their names on it. So there was at least an understanding at that time that they were both contributors. And then you have Pauline Kael, who comes later and really opens the conversation, questioning, okay, was it really Herman Mankiewicz who wrote this? Did Orson Welles do anything? Like, did he, or was this really a collaboration? And I like to think that this was basically Herman Mankiewicz's, you know, like I think he delivered like 100 pages to Welles of a script, and that was the basis. And then Welles kind of just added his touches to his vision. But I mean, also filmmaking is a collaborative experience. Wells couldn't have done this alone. He himself acknowledged all the players who helped him with this. So to me, it seems like it was not an equal contribution, but they both should be recognized for their contributions. But I know there's still a lot of debate about it.
There is, but I think that's a very fair way to look at it, because Wells himself told Peter Bogdanovich that Mankiewicz's contribution was enormous. Wells
Mm-hmm.
was always happy to concede that Mankiewicz had come up with the idea of Rosebud,
Mm-hmm.
which Wells referred to as a gimmick at one point. There were rumours about Wells wanting to claim solo credit for the screenplay, but that Mankiewicz was able to whip up some support within Hollywood to stop that happening, and the compromise move was the equal screenwriting credit. I think there's something fitting about that, because we're going to come on to talk about Greg Toland, but there's an idea running through the film of Kane being contradictory. So it's just interesting that Wells was like maybe protective of his screenplay credit, and there was a bit of chicanery there, but then actually very generous because Toland gets credited on the same card as the director later on. So it's kind of interesting to see both the generosity of spirit and maybe the ego in a way. With Pauline Kael's essay, so Raising Kane from 1971, it's like a really long, I think it was published in the New Yorker in two parts to begin with, but very, very long essay. It is very entertaining, and I do think people should check it out if they're interested. It was a few years ago I read it now, because I read it when the film Mank came out, but
Right.
she basically goes too far in emphasizing Mankiewicz's contribution to the screenplay, because you're kind of given the impression that he did virtually everything, and there are reasons why that essay is regarded as a big misstep by Kael, because she was accused of
Mm-hmm.
overlooking certain things and not speaking to some people who she could have spoken to and things like that. And you mentioned Robert Carringer, I think, earlier, and
Right.
I think some of the work he has done has shown that actually his contribution was substantial and in a way definitive. Like everything that stayed in Citizen Kane, everything was kind of filtered through what Wells thought, no matter where it originated. I think with Kael, she kind of had an issue with the idea of the auteur theory and auteurism. So you can sort of see what she was writing about Citizen Kane as an attempt to combat this idea of the all-powerful auteur. You kind of have to factor in where she was coming from, and she was a bit of a contrarian generally. I think the shame is that the film Mank revived some of this a few years ago, because
Yeah,
I don't know if you saw that movie, but even there
I
you're
did.
still kind of left with the impression that Herman Mankiewicz was kind of handing this thing over to Wells to film but he didn't get much input from Wells along the way, is kind of how I remember it. So it seemed to resurrect that debate in a way, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, really, it's a depiction of this tormented writer, on a deadline, having all sorts of, health and emotional issues, trying to deliver, one of the great scripts of all time. And yeah, yeah, it does kind of, although I have to say, movies in the past like decade or so have been trying to change a little bit of Hollywood history. I think of Trumbo trying to change Edward G. Robinson's involvement in the blacklist, and that wasn't very kind. And so you have to take sort of these things with a grain of salt. They are based on truth, but it's also, there's some poetic license too. And one thing I actually heard about Pauline Kael, I haven't read that the Raising Cain, but I did see in an interview that she had seen that there were no notes from Herman Mankiewicz's secretary about Wells's contributions, but someone else said, well, Wells had his own secretary who would have noted that, and that wasn't something that maybe Kael had looked into, or it could be something when you're looking at product of the past and you don't necessarily have all the information, or you weren't there actually doing it, there's only so much you can glean from it. So that's something we should just keep in mind. Even things that we're talking about today, this is our perspective years later.
Yeah. Okay, Raquel, at this point, I think we'll take a quick break and then come back and talk a bit more about Citizen Kane. Okay, we are back. We are still talking about Citizen Kane, and we've talked a bit about, the story, the way the story is told, the origins of the story. Raquel, what about this film's mastery of technique? I think we've already alluded to this, but it's the kind of film that's really great to study, isn't it? Because of the things like the cinematography and the editing. Yeah, where do we even begin with this? Why is this film such an interesting film technically, would you say?
I think most of it is the composition. Some of the scenes are built so beautifully and thematically and visually arresting in the deep focus, in how the camera is positioned. The camera could be above the characters. It could, they cut a hole in the floor to put the camera underneath for those great shots at the newspaper office that you can see from below to above. It almost reminds me a little bit of Yasujiro Ozu, who had the camera very, very low on this little device, and you get all these very low shots, and you get some of that in this movie as well. The one I have to go back to my favorite scene, where at the boarding house, because that is one really great example of the mastery of technique in this movie. So you have young Charles Foster Kane outside in the snow, and the camera goes into the boarding house, and there's this window in the back where you see Kane in outside still playing with Rosebud, and it's almost like he's like, this is a frame
Yeah.
of the memory of his childhood, because it's sort of an idyllic look into this one happy moment that he has that is going to be taken away shortly. Then you have the father sort of in the living room, and then Agnes Moorehead, the mother, is in the foreground, negotiating everything with Mr. Thatcher. And they're in the very foreground. They're the ones in control of the situation. Her more so, because she's at the very front. Thatcher's just off her, and they're having these conversations right up against the camera, which happens several times throughout the movie as well with other characters. Then you have the father sort of traveling between the living room and the room that the sort of a sitting room or maybe dining room that they're in. And you can tell that he's not really in control, but he's an adult. So he's sort of in the conversation, but he's being left out. So he's kind of wavering in between. But Kane, who has no control of the situation, he's completely removed in this sort of like idyllic window setting. And just how that is structured is just amazing, because visually it's really interesting with these three layers, but thematically totally makes sense based off the different levels of power each character has, from Kane having none to the mother and Thatcher having all of the power at the very front. And you get that a lot in movies, in the rest of the movie. The scenes in the newspaper office where they're welcoming Kane back in, and you have the big trophy, and everyone's faces are sort of fit into every little crevice. And there's a lot of in the newspaper sequences, there's a lot of sort of these manic shots of people's faces really close up and all this energy. And then later on, you have Kane after he lost his governor race, and the camera is incredibly low. It's an empty newspaper office. There's these political signs and these streamers, and everything's abandoned. And you have this very stark angle from the very floor up to
Yeah.
them, this empty space, which contrasts greatly to how full the space was before at the very height of Kane's success. And those are just a few examples. You can break down so many of the sequences. Like you were saying earlier about how there were two about Susan Kane's, debut as an opera singer. There's one great shot of her singing, and then the camera pans up through the rafters, and then you have the two crew members. One holds his nose like this stinks, and then all
Yeah.
sorts of like overlays of newspapers and light bulbs going out. And I just want to call out one thing though that still resonates today. In that sequence where the audience stopped clapping pretty quickly, and Charles Foster Kane is clapping like very, very harshly, and he gets up and keeps clapping, and it's a really uncomfortable scene. That is a meme. That's a GIF that people still that use today to depict basically a strong enthusiasm for something that maybe other people don't have, or it just kind of
Yeah.
shows this really over the top enthusiasm.
Yeah.
But I have to say, not to ramble on, but there's so many sequences you can pull out and just analyze, and you can really see the mastery of the technique and how they were composed with a lot of thought behind them.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, to go back to scenes like you were talking about with the log cabin scene, and you had mentioned the use of deep focus. So just to break that
Mm-hmm.
down slightly for people, so deep focus is where there's a greater depth of field, and it's famously used in this movie because you get scenes where the entire composition is in sharp focus. And Greg Toland had experimented with deep focus prior to Citizen Kane, and Kane
Mm-hmm.
and Wells allowed him to, push those experiments further. There's an interesting debate, or there certainly was at the time, in the middle of the 20th century, about the use of deep focus and how films were constructed, because I think the idea is that using a technique like deep focus gives the viewer more control over what you can look at. Although, of course, somebody like Wells is going to cue the viewer's attention in different ways. It could be depending on who's speaking at any time, or, who's facing the camera, that sort of thing. But Wells wanted to avoid more traditional techniques of shot, reverse shot, I think, and he doesn't do that very often. The idea was that deep focus was seen to facilitate reality in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And the critic Andre Bazin talked about this. He argued that editing disrupts reality, fragments it. So deep focus, by contrast, allows you to draw closer to reality. The other point I picked up about deep focus is I read the Laura Mulvey BFI book about Citizen Kane, and she made a very interesting point I hadn't considered, which is there's kind of a poetic justice to deep focus being used so much in a film which attacks William Randolph Hearst, because he's kind of an old style impresario, and deep focus is more of like a new style cinematography that also can be associated with like photo magazines like Life, which were rivaling
Mm-hmm.
traditional newspapers. So I thought that was a good point. I also think the editing is worth picking up on. I think that
Yes.
1941 audiences would have found some of the transitions here really innovative and sometimes startling. Sometimes you get quite shocking cuts, or quite bracing cuts maybe, where Like you get the squawking bird, don't you, when Thompson is going to Xanadu to see the butler?
It's a jump scare.
Yeah. And they're not always that abrupt, but there's kind of a genius, I think, to the way it compresses time.
Yeah.
My favourite one is maybe when it cuts from Merry Christmas to and a Happy New Year, and in the cut you go forward a few years in time, don't you? Because when you get to Happy New Year, it's when Kane is approaching his 25th birthday and he's grown up a bit, you know. So I think the editing, Robert Wise's editing is a big feature of the film as well, I would say.
Yeah, it really elevates the movie because they were on such a tight budget and they're working with these sets that look really big, but in many cases were actually quite small, and just there was a lot to do with layering and editing that kind of adds that grandiose view without actually them having to include there's some scenes, for example, the scene that they're taking the picnic, and Charles Foster Kane's like, no, I want to go on a picnic, or I want to go camping, and they're on the beach and there's this caravan of vehicles having to bring everything, like the entertainment, the elaborate tent, all of the things that Charles Foster Kane needs for this trip, which is over the top. But apparently they had to splice in like I think maybe a painting to make it look like a large caravan of cars. Or in the scene where Kane is running for governor, it's not actually a really huge space with a lot of people in it. There's some techniques there too. And going back to the scene of Susan Kane performing opera, and she's obviously terrible and everyone's reacting to it, that upward shot, it goes up from the stage and goes through the rafters quite a long ways, and there's like these sort of rafters that break up the scene, and it goes from a set to miniatures and miniatures and miniatures, and then back to an actual set with the two crew members. So it makes it look like it's a very large space, but it really isn't. And that goes to the editing, because the editing can just break off at those different rafters and make that scene look very long and grandiose.
Yeah.
And one thing I want to call out too, so I love the scenes with Susan Kane, because a lot of them are done very well. She's drinking at the bar, and the camera kind of goes down into the skylight and then arrives into the bar. I think that's a fantastic scene. And then obviously the opera scenes. And this is not necessarily Robert Wise's doing. This is probably more sound editing. But I had watched one of the extras on the Criterion 4K for Citizen Kane. Actually, I think it was Ben Burt who pointed it out. He's a sound designer. And he said that in the sequence where Charles Foster Kane and Susan are in the tent and he slaps her, there's the sound of a woman screaming in the background. And it's got nothing to do with what's happening in this private moment. However, that could symbolize the screaming in Susan Kane's head, because she is at a loss in how to continue this marriage. And this pivotal moment of violence kind of sets off the final of the finality of their marriage. And I'm like, that's some great sound editing. Maybe it was on purpose, maybe it wasn't, but that is a nice form of editing there.
There's so much great trickery all throughout the film. If people are able to access Roger Ebert's commentary on the film, I'd recommend that, because he talks about quite a few interesting techniques. So, for example, there are many scenes where there's quite a low ceiling, a visible ceiling at the top of the frame. But very often the ceilings were made of cloth, so that the microphones could be placed above the ceiling and could capture the sound. That's fascinating. That scene you mentioned with the camera at El Rancho, where Susan Alexander is after Kane's death, the first time, there's lightning or whatever, and the second time is when she's willing to talk and the weather is different. But the camera seems to travel through the El Rancho sign, and the way that was done is that the sign broke away into two parts that could be pulled away as the camera's passing through. Actually, that log cabin scene is another example where, if you look at it, the camera seems to travel through where the breakfast table, or where the table would be. And it's the same technique. It's that the table broke into two parts and could be reassembled as the camera passes through. So you sort of see, I think there's a hat on the table or something that wobbles And that's kind of the giveaway that the table has just been fastened back into place.
I love that approach. Let's break stuff in half. Let's, cut a hole in the floor just to get these different angles.
Yeah.
I remember hearing somewhere that Alfred Hitchcock was not afraid to just cut a hole in a wall and stick the camera right through it just to get the best angle. And I think that makes for really interesting filmmaking.
Yeah. The ingenuity, I think, is
Yes.
marvelous in this film.
I have to say also with the low ceilings, that scene with Kane after his second wife leaves him, and her bedroom is almost like a child's room. It's got these paintings of horses everywhere, and it's quite small in comparison to the other rooms in the house, like the living room with that over the top fireplace that Kane can't even fit like into because it's so large. And this room is quite small with a low ceiling, and then when she leaves, he starts to destroy everything. And it's such a confined space. And that's very symbolic throughout the movie, these really large spaces and these really confined spaces and what they mean depending on what part of Kane's life like we're at.
Yeah. Like you mentioned earlier, I think the amount of low angle shots that show him as kind of a looming presence is a real
Yes.
thing in the movie. And what about Susan Alexander? I was thinking about her as you were talking there, and like we've talked about the opera premiere, which goes disastrously. Like you say, that scene with the guys up in the rafters, that's a really great touch. That's an interesting moment, which is kind of about cinematic technique, isn't it? In the sense that the film doesn't really glamorize her. She's the main woman character, but it doesn't really do what other films from the same sort of era might do to glamorize her. But I think that must be because, it kind of needs you not to think the same way as Charles Kane is thinking. Because he is kind of besotted with her. He is convinced that she's got what it takes, but the audience kind of can't think that, can they? The audience has to kind of see the reality of her lack of talent, I suppose.
That's very accurate because throughout the whole movie we realize, okay, she's not the vision that he thought she was. I mean, when we meet her, she's drunk at a table at a bar. Later on, when we have that meet cute moment, she has a toothache. So she's not being portrayed, and she's living in a boarding house. So she's not portrayed in like the best light, and then we could see that maybe she's not the best singer. There's that great sequence where she has that Italian opera singer coach. Like he's so frustrated with her. He's trying to get her in tune. He's trying to get her on time with and Kane waltzes in. He's like, I'm not paying you to give your opinions on my wife's performance. I'm paying you to I don't know, train her. And he's like, okay, let's just have her play. And she plays, and it's obviously she sings and she's not that good. And the coach knows that she's not good, but Kane looks like he just heard the best music of his life. So we're in agreement with the coach, and we see the reality of it, but we also see Kane in the he's looking through rose-colored glasses at this scenario that is kind of all made up in his mind.
Yeah, so it's so fascinating how the film kind of does hold us at a distance from him.
Mm-hmm.
And we build up this complex picture of him that is contradictory, and he remains kind of always out of reach, I think, his true motivations, and it's such a fascinating approach, I think. The other moment, we were talking about editing, the other great transition I wanted to highlight was when you go from the photograph of the staff at the Chronicle newspaper to them all having been poached by Kane for his newspaper. That is
a beautiful moment. I love it.
Moment. Yeah, absolutely.
And also that is very conducive to how corporations work, just poaching other people from other companies. And I was just like, this is a Jeff Bezos moment, or like you can name lots of different figures, but no, the transition between that and how they arranged everyone to look exactly like the picture is just brilliant.
It's incredible, yeah. And like I say, that's one of the moments that Ebert unpacks on that commentary about how it was actually achieved, if anyone is interested. Were there any other standout moments, Raquel, that we haven't mentioned that really jump out at you as worth highlighting while you're thinking about that. One I wanted to mention absolutely is the breakfast table scene with Kane and his first wife, where we keep going back and forth between the two of them, and it kind of charts the deterioration of their relationship, doesn't it? From them being like deeply in love to gradually more tense as they talk about his publication's attitude to her father, the president. Or is it uncle the president? Is it? She's the niece, is it? Or daughter? I can't remember.
Yes, he calls the president Uncle John.
Uncle John. Yeah, that's right. But I think that's a great sequence because it culminates. We just kind of go back and forth between the medium shots of them, don't we? But then we see the sort of physical distance between them at either end of the table.
Yeah.
Kind of mirroring the emotional distance, and the music's great too because the music changes as the montage plays out. So that's one I would highlight. How about you?
Yes, I was actually going to mention that one because I think it's great that they're like at the very beginning, they're in their newlywed phase. They're kind of sitting together, and she's just complaining on every single conversation about he works too long and he's not available. And at first, it's just like a nice sort of flirtatious conversation. Then they're on opposite ends of the table, and as each conversation progresses, you can tell like there's more and more tension. It almost feels like the table is getting longer and they're being pulled further apart, but they're still at the same table at the same ends. But I think that's a brilliant way of how to show the growing tension between them. And of course that culminates with the great sequence in the boarding house where the first wife is approaching the mistress, and then the political rival is there too. And that's almost structured the similar way as that boarding house scene towards the beginning, with the characters sort of moving, and there's this great shot of Kane. He's in darkness and he comes into the light and he makes his final decision, and that ruins his political career but sets himself up for his second marriage. And so I think that scene is great. And I just want to go back to just after you see the shot of the photo of the staff from the Chronicle, and then they're there and in the actual office of the Enquirer, and they're throwing this big party. And that whole sequence, there's lots of interesting shots, a lot of manic moments. But what I think is interesting is that Leland and Bernstein, Joseph Cotton's character, is in the foreground having this conversation with basically both Kane's right hand men, and they're having this conversation. They're having to yell at each other because there's so much chaos happening in the background. So that's another layered shot, like another deep focus shot, where you have these two people having this sort of serious conversation, so like a table in the background, and then a really interesting angle where Charles Kane is dancing with the dancers and having this fun time. And I just love how that is set up. The table sort of is in a diagonal space, sort of in the right corner, and that makes it very kind of visually arresting and different to the eye. And yeah, there's so many great scenes of composition in this movie. We could talk about it for hours.
No, it's true. We could be here all day if we were talking about all the standout moments of the film.
Yeah.
I did want to quickly say again another word on the newsreel, which I think must have been one of the more original sequences for audiences at the time. I'm sure people felt that way. Going back to what you were saying about how the story doesn't confuse us here, even though the chronology in other hands might have confused us. I do think the newsreel is really useful there because the newsreel kind of gives you everything, like at the outset of the film, doesn't it? It kind of gives you the lowdown on his relationships and, his rise and fall. And
we get a full documentary before the movie even really kicks off.
Yeah. So that is interesting because it kind of changes things from, we're not kind of wondering how things are going to pan out so much after that, but we're kind of wondering, exactly how is the relationship between right. these people going to go sour.
In my recent viewing, I had Pauline Kael's book, the Citizen Kane book, which is half Raising Kane, but also half of it is the shooting script. And I was just kind of seeing how the shooting script matched the newsreel, and the newsreel that ends up in the movie is actually much more involved. There's even more stuff happening than in the shooting script. So
Mm.
I just think it's interesting. It's a good chunk of the beginning of the movie, and it's quite impactful, and it's just different. Like you don't really, I mean, it's not necessarily a technique that we see in a lot of movies, but you can see it in other things. I know Martin Scorsese said that he was very inspired by that, and that led to some scenes in Goodfellas, and other films that he made. And that's one thing that also speaks to the power of Citizen Kane, how it's influenced filmmakers to come and kind of
Yeah.
grew its branches and kind of touched lots of other great cinema to come.
I think that's a good point, and I also think the newsreel goes back to the importance of Robert Wise's editing, because I think he kind of
Hmm.
distressed some of the film, and
Yeah.
I think the idea that the film, like we said, it doesn't have the biggest budget, but there are techniques used within that newsreel that kind of make you think this is more like epic politically than it actually is. Stock footage of big crowds, and you cut to somebody speaking, and all those kinds of things are a lot of fun. Um, yeah. So, what about the impact of the movie then? I mean, you were talking there about Scorsese and his appreciation for Citizen Kane. I suppose the context here is that, like we said, not a huge financial success immediately,
Hmm.
but was well reviewed. Bosley Crowther said it comes close to being the most sensational film ever made in Hollywood. So it was already getting that kind of acclaim right from the outset. We've talked about the innovative style of the film, and that was noticed immediately and talked about immediately. And then you mentioned the Oscars, so just one win at the Oscars for the original screenplay for Mankiewicz and Wells, as we talked about.
Yes.
I think you wanted to talk more about the Oscars, didn't you, Raquel? Because it's one of those films that people can't understand now why Citizen Kane didn't win Best Picture, but of course, that's not how it went down.
Yeah, I was examining just all of the nominees for the different categories. This, like you said, this was nominated for 9 categories. It only won one of the Oscars, which was for Best Original Screenplay, which went to both Herman Mankiewicz and Orson Welles. And I was looking at that category, and it was up against not that many great movies. I think the only one of note is Sergeant York that's in that, and even that is not at the level of Citizen Kane. In that category, too, was Tall, Dark, and Handsome, which is a very kind of silly Christmas mobster movie with Cesar Romero. And I'm like, of course, Citizen Kane won in this category because this competition wasn't very stiff. But then if you look at Best Motion Picture, it's up against How Green Was My Valley, which won. Here Comes Mr. Jordan, which is one of my favorite movies. The Maltese Falcon, it was up against in several things. Even in the music category, Bernard Herrmann beat out himself. He won. He was nominated twice, once for Citizen Kane and once for another movie, and he won the other one. And this is indicative to maybe the sentiment at the time of this being a very, controversial subject matter, maybe that kind of soured the Academy. This was also a time where these nominations were very much sponsored by the studios. They submitted what they wanted to consider. And a lot of times the nominees were based off of like, okay, this one was from RKO, this one is from Warner Brothers. So in some cases, the best actor, best actress category was just one from each studio. So RKO really did push this movie, having it not, and it was nominated for 9, but the fact that it only won one and that was the weakest of the categories is really sad. But this movie has gone on to have such a great legacy. Like you were mentioning, the auteur theory later on, that really revived an interest in this movie. Then it's just been studied. Then filmmakers were influenced by it, and then Orson Welles himself just being this lifelong eccentric, quirky figure who was in the public conversation for his entire life. I think that also kind of helps with the legacy of it. So, yeah, I think a lot of different factors came into play, but the Academy Awards, a lot of people say How Green Was My Valley is not necessarily what should have won. And I was at a screening of How Green Was My Valley at the TCM Festival, and Maureen O'Hara was there. It was a great experience. And at the end of the movie, I hear somebody behind me say, "That beat out Citizen Kane."
Yeah, no, I think there are certain films that's a great example, but I think there are films that people are quite dismissive of because they actually win Best Picture, and people get fixated on
Yes.
what they beat out. So Ordinary People beating Raging Bull or Dances with Wolves beating Goodfellas, and
Hmm.
I do think sometimes it gets in the way of people appreciating certain films. But
Oh, Green
um,
Rose My Valley is a wonderful movie. I personally would have chose Citizen Kane or The Maltese Falcon, but of course, like the Oscars depends on what movies came out that year, the sentiment at the time, the voters, what they were approaching, even just sort of politics in the entertainment industry, all sorts of factors that it's hard to look back now with our with our modern perspective and kind of assign things because
yeah,
maybe How Green Was My Valley was the best choice in that time.
and just in terms of those perceptions of Citizen Kane as a classic, then. Like
Hmm.
you mentioned earlier, there's the Sight and Sound esteem that was heaped upon it. So, Sight and
Yeah.
Sound magazine every 10 years does a greatest films of all time poll, a critics poll. And this started in 1952. Now, in 1952, Citizen Kane wasn't in the top 10. It first appears in the top 10 in 1962 for Sight and Sound, and it hits the top spot immediately. And then it was there for a long, long time 62, 72, 82, 92, 2002. 2002 would have been the year I first saw Citizen Kane, and I just remember it kind of had that reputation of the greatest film, and it just kind of
Hmm.
felt unsurmountable, like nothing would ever knock it off its perch in a way on that metric. But then in 2012, Citizen Kane dropped to second behind Vertigo, and
It
then
was
in
a
20
huge scandal, I remember.
it was a big moment, yeah. And then in 2022, Citizen Kane dropped to third place behind Vertigo in second and Gian Dielman in
Hmm.
first, which was probably an even bigger shake-up.
Yes.
So you've got that kind of perception of it as a classic. Like I say, by 1962, for Sight and Sound, people are already saying it's the greatest film ever. You've got the growth of like film studies courses in colleges and universities. You've got things like you said, like the French New Wave generation loving Citizen Kane. You see books about Citizen Kane begin to appear. So
Hmm.
it kind of builds that daunting reputation. I don't think you can ever really claim any single film to be the greatest film ever made, but I do think Citizen
Right.
Kane makes a lot of makes a lot of sense for that choice because to go back to what you were saying earlier, it's like that thing of Wells being independent within the studio system. So
Yeah.
it's a great example of film as a mass medium, but also film as an art, if you see what I mean.
Right. Right.
It represents a film that's both of Hollywood and not of Hollywood, then, doesn't it? So,
That is true. That is true because I love that line about him being an indie filmmaker within the studio system because he's really not part of the studio system, but the studio system is what gives him the money, the studio space, the Academy Awards push, all of that, all the people that he needs. It's sort of the basis where he can launch off his art, but it does not in the scheme of the studio system. There's so many movies you can analyze in comparison to this that really do fit the studio system mold. This just really stands out. It's just amazing that it even got made.
yeah. And I think there's a quote from Francois Truffaut from 1959 that I saw where he said,
Mm.
the appearance of Citizen Kane was an extraordinary event for cinephiles of our generation. So, yeah, I think it's the whole package. I think it's, like we've said, there's a lot of virtuosity, technically,
Hmm.
and it's still like an energizing, entertaining movie. So, yeah, Raquel, any final thoughts on Citizen Kane? Like we said, we can talk about Citizen Kane all day potentially. One episode can't do it justice, but is there anything else you wanted to highlight before we move on here?
I just wanted to talk about a little bit about how this is very much indicative of the phrase "go big or go home," because maybe because of the passage of time, we've missed a little bit of the boldness of this film even being made. The fact that it's tackling such a hugely powerful mogul in the media, William Randolph Hearst, even though Orson Welles claimed that it wasn't him, it's obviously him because Xanadu is very much like the Hearst Castle, and Susan is very much like Marion Davies. And one person had pointed out the fact that the movie tackles alcoholism. You both have that with the Joseph Cotton character. He gets fired at one point, I believe, because he's just prone to drinking. And then Susan Kane, after Kane's death, is drinking herself into her demise because we just see her basically in different states of being drunk when she's being interviewed. And William Randolph Hearst was very, very sensitive about alcoholism because Marion Davies had her own issues with alcohol, and that was a very much a sore point. So the fact that that's included in the script and the story is quite bold. It's kind of shocking. We lose that now if you don't know that information. And one thing I also wanted to say is you had mentioned Peter Bogdanovich earlier. Now, Orson Welles and Peter Bogdanovich were good friends. I think Orson Welles even lived with Peter Bogdanovich at one point. They were very close. And Bogdanovich made his own Citizen Kane, which not a lot of people talk about. There's a film called The Cat's Meow. It came out in 2001. And that's about William Randolph Hearst's relationship with Marion Davies during the time where Thomas Ince died. It's one of the great scandals of Hollywood that with the Fatty Arbuckle case ended up leading to the production code. And that film kind of focuses on Thomas Ince's death, but also William Randolph Hearst controlling Marion Davies's drinking and her possible affair with Charlie Chaplin. And to me, like it's not obviously at the level of Citizen Kane, but I kind of like to think of it as Bogdanovich's answer because he's approaching the Hearst story directly, in a way, and maybe there's some Wells influence there since they were so close.
You know what? I've seen that movie, but all I remember is sort of scenes on the boat, and it's been a long, long time. No, I think in terms of what you're saying about go big or go home, I think that's a great point. And yeah, Citizen Kane is like a testament to that idea. Yeah, it's still thrilling. I think that sense of Wells kind of shaking things up. You know, even this many years later, I think there's something really impressive about that. So it's one of those films that does deserve its reputation, I think, for sure. Okay, Raquel, so we are approaching the end here. Now, I said at the outset of the episode that people should stay tuned to the end for an announcement. So now is the time. And this comes in two parts. So the first part is this. So this is the last episode in this current run of the Movie Palace podcast. Thank you very much to everyone who's tuned in since the show returned last year. It's been great fun to bring new episodes to you. Thank you as well to Raquel and all the other guests who have appeared on new episodes. It's not the end definitively. I will be back further on up the road, but not for a while. And part of the reason is related to the second part of this announcement, which is that Raquel and I are starting our own podcast, which is going to be called the Cine Historians Podcast. And Raquel, I'll throw over to you there to tell people a little bit about it.
So we're so excited to launch this new podcast. So the Cine Historians is going to be a research-intensive podcast that takes a deep dive into film history from the very early days of film to modern day. So the entire scope. And each season will be on a theme, and those themes will be either filmmakers, a genre, a style, or a movement. And we're going to examine that particular theme over several episodes, and each episode will approach a different topic of that theme. And we're really looking to examine the impact of that theme over time and how it relates to the history of cinema. Just for example, the first season we'll be talking about new waves. So the movements in different countries where there was a significant shift in how movies were being made. And for one example, we'll have a couple episodes on the French New Wave, which is probably the most well-known of those waves. So one thing we're really excited about is the focus is not going to be just old Hollywood or even Hollywood. We're going to be examining filmmaking on a global scale. So we'll definitely be talking about movies made in Hollywood, but also a lot of movies made around the world. And we're really hoping that you'll be inspired to expand your scope of world cinema, and that you'll not only learn something new from each of our episodes, but that will entertain you as well.
It's going to be so much fun. As we record now, we haven't started recording these episodes, so there's going to be a lot of information to come about the release dates and so on. So at this stage, we can tell you a few things. Firstly, that it will be both an audio podcast and also it will be on YouTube as well. There'll be a video podcast version of each episode on YouTube. So to follow the show at this point, you can go to Twitter or X and go to @CineHistorians, which is all one word. So CineHistorians. And where else can people find us, Raquel? There's our Gmail address as well, isn't there?
Yeah, and our Gmail is cinehistorians@gmail.com. And like you said, you can find us on Twitter. And on video, our YouTube channel is just youtube.com/cinehistorians. And also find us on Letterboxd, which is also @cinehistorians. And we're anywhere you look for us, you can find us with that name.
Yeah, and it's going to be very, very exciting. And I think it's going to be great. We're going to look at some great films. We're going to look at some, broad historical context. And I think it's going to be very, hopefully, informative and entertaining. And we're very much looking forward to starting that podcast. So that's great. Raquel, before we go, where can people find you online elsewhere with all the other things that you do?
You can find me at raquelstetcher.com. That is my writing portfolio. And I have links to my classic movie blog, Out of the Past, as well as my new movie blog, Kel Movies, on there. I also have my articles that I've written for TCM and for Netflix, and some of my YouTube scripts, and all of my social medias on there too. So it's just a one-stop shop.
Great stuff. Thank you, Raquel. And just before I go, you can stay in touch with any news pertaining to the Movie Palace podcast, mainly on Twitter @MoviePalacePod. Like I say, it's not the end, it's the end for now. And the podcast is also on Instagram and on TikTok. But I'll be seeing you, listeners, and I hope you can join me next time when the curtain rises once again at the Movie Palace.